Welcome to City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Greg McPherson, City Club President. For 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB or viewing on Portland Community Media or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Bank of the Cascades, Stoll Reeves LLP, Family Care Health, Russell Fellows Properties, and The Standard. Please show our appreciation for all of them. African Americans constitute nearly 1 million of the total 2.4 million people incarcerated in the United States. On a local level, blacks are 6 times more likely to be in Multnomah County jails than whites, according to a recent report by the Macarthur Foundation. Joining us to consider this issue are representatives from the criminal justice system. They are Lane Borg, Executive Director for Metropolitan Public Defender Services, Kevin Modica, Portland's Assistant Police Chief for Community Services, Multnomah County Judge Edward Jones, and Rod Underhill, District Attorney for the county. Moderating today is Erica Pruitt, Adult Services Director for Multnomah County Community Justice. Before we hear from our panel, County Commissioner Judy Shiprack will provide an overview of the Macarthur Foundation report. Please welcome our guests to City Club.
Good afternoon, City Club. My name is Judy Shiprack. I am the Multnomah County Commissioner representing District Number 3, which is mostly Southeast Portland, from Cesar Chavez to 148th, and from the Banfield to the Clackamas County line. My role today is to provide you with some context about a very tough problem, a troubling and persistent problem, and a deep injustice in our community. And I also hope that knowing that we are capable and that we have the desire, that we can gather together here to help heal this community. I arrived in Portland just about 44 years ago with a big dream of becoming a high school teacher. I did that. I taught at Adams, Jefferson, and Madison high schools, and then I had another big dream, and I went to law school at night at Lewis and Clark, and I became an attorney. I got a job with the Multnomah County DA's office as a prosecutor. Sadly, this position reintroduced me to some of my former students. Then I went to the state capitol as a representative from Southeast Portland, from a blue-collar district, for 3 terms of office. With that background, I was elected to this office in 2008, and I am term limited, so this gives me an additional sense of urgency. I am currently the co-chair of LPSCC. LPSCC. That's the Local Public Safety Coordinating Council. It's a group that includes the presiding judge of the Circuit Court, the district attorney, the Metropolitan Public Defender's Office, the chief criminal judge, the Citizens Crime Commission, the Department of Community Justice, the Portland Police Bureau, the Sheriff's Office, Portland Public Schools, the Health Department, mental health representatives. We have been meeting consistently since 1996. We are data-driven, intention-driven, and that room is full of talent, experience, access, leverage, and goodwill. And we have been aware of and concerned by the disparity in racial involvement in the justice system for over 15 years, and as we all now know, we have failed to make the change our community needs. In early 2015, Multnomah County was one of 20 communities nationwide out of 191 applicants selected by the Macarthur Foundation to participate in the Safety and Justice Challenge. Racial and ethnic disparity, or RED, is one of the issues prioritized in our work. RRI stands for Relative Rate Index. In Multnomah County, we have 750,000 people, and the Black population is just under 6% of that. The RRI is a ratio. It sets the white population at 1. Anything below 1 means the rate of incarceration is below that of the white population. And anything above means the incarceration rate is above the white population. What we know is that there is great cause for concern when the RRI for arrest for a Black person in this community is 4, and the likelihood, or RRI, to go to prison if you are a Black person in this community is 7. Our strategy to address this is community engagement, and I started this exercise talking about me. Let me tell you what I know about you. I know that you are an engaged community. This is a high-level group. I believe you're in good hands with Erica and our panel, so I leave you to our work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Shiprack. And if you're just tuning in on OPB, you're listening to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, and we're talking about the racial disparities in our local jails. I'm Erica Pruitt of Multnomah County's Department of Community Justice, and I'm honored to be here today with Portland's Assistant Police Chief, Kevin Modica, Circuit Court Judge Edward Jones, Public Defender and Advocate Lane Bork, and District Attorney Rod Underhill. So thank you for being here today. So I want to just start on the conversation. So first of all, understanding that there are several decision points that contribute to the troubling disparities that were identified in the Macarthur Red Report, I want to ask you, Chief Modica, and Rod, I want you to share some here as well. What are your thoughts on how we got to this place? Please elaborate on what worries you about the criminal justice system that you have the influence and the power to change. So, Chief Modica.
Thank you, and good afternoon. I'm a lot older than I sound. My voice just cracked, so I'm not 12, I'm 57. I've been 30 years with the Portland Police Bureau, and before that, about 5 years working for a local county in jail. And I determined I did not want to be in jail for 30 years, so I came to a municipality to work for the police force. So there are two sides of context to this. One is it is abundantly apparent that communities of color have been over-policed in America. It is abundantly apparent that as police leaders, we have to have enough organizational courage to admit that what those thought were notional truths had always been happening. It really came to life as our social media platforms illustrated many of the troubling scenes and interactions that have occurred across the country, and especially in communities of color. And that's not to vilify police work or law enforcement. As eloquently as our Attorney General said yesterday, these are moments by which we are all judged. Having said that and seeing this data, it is time for us to change our practice and inform our practice by policy. And if you're a historian of the last 20 or 25 years, there were a lot of things that motivated law enforcement to heavily suppress, to stop and frisk, the war on drugs. And, you know, I think it's pretty apparent that while there might have been some successes, it really has been a failure for the general society, and that we all feel it. And we have an obligation to move forward and change our policy and practice.
Thank you, Chief Modica. Rod, what do you think about that? What brings us to this place?
Well, thank you, Erica. And I want to begin with thanking the City Club for bringing us all together and having this very important conversation, and also Macarthur's work that helps bring this very critical conversation to the forefront. It is you know, it's just imperative that communities of color have confidence in their public safety system. I, like all of you that have read the report, found many aspects of it troubling and in many ways disappointing. We believe we have an outstanding public safety community here, that we sometimes think we're maybe immune from some of the other troubles that occur around the country that AC Modica just referred to, but the truth of it is we have those challenges here, and it's time to roll up our sleeves and look closer at ourselves and figure out what we can do. When I read the report, it's accurate to say that as the district attorney in Multnomah County, I have touch points in essentially every decision point. It's also more accurate to say that my office is more primarily responsible on some of those points. One of those points is sentencing. When I look at that sentencing information, when I think about it, it's accurate to say while I don't sign the judgment order, Judge Jones, for example, hasn't allowed me quite yet to do that, the district attorney's office is really at the forefront of those conversations. So when I read that information, I'm bothered. Bothered is maybe too polite of a word. I look at other parts of that, of the assessment as well. Some, for example, deal with the cases that are referred to my office and what we move forward, or in other words, issue. Cases convicted and sentenced to jail. And while I recognize that we, as a district attorney's office, do not add to the RRI, we do not add to the disparity, which I'm proud of and thankful for, I also need to remind myself that we do not make it better. We do not reduce that disparity that initially comes to us. When I look at what can we do to possibly change the trajectory of this conversation, I'm encouraged to know that even before this report, the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office and other members of the public safety conversation, not just in Oregon, but not just in Multnomah County, but in Oregon, did some dedicated work on prison reform, House Bill 3194. 3194 was passed in July of 2013, and in a nutshell, it essentially asked us to send less people of whatever race, background, ethnicity to prison, and that we could take those savings and reinvest them in our community. Multnomah County rolled up their sleeves, participated heavily in that effort. I did personally as well, and that bill passed. And Multnomah County then came up with a program called the Mc Jrp Program. And essentially, without going into the details, 1,000 people who are, according to the sentencing rules, predetermined to go to prison, according to the sentencing rules. And before the Mc Jrp program, 55% of those did go to prison. So 550 out of 1,000. Today, our statistics tell us that over 50% reduction because of that program. So in other words, we now are only sending 30% to prison. 22.8% of that Mc Jrp population are individuals of color, and specifically that number applies to their individuals that are African American. What we don't know, and what people at this table and some of you out in the audience want to find out is, has that program, while we've done a great job of sending less people to prison, have we impacted in a positive way the RRI rate? And that's work that needs to be done, and we're looking into it.
Okay. Thank you, Rod. Lane, in the Oregonian, you stated that we must take unequivocal ownership of this discrimination and put a stop to it. Given what the data tells us, what strategies have you begun to implement or plan to implement to eliminate these disparities? And also, who needs to be at the table in these discussions?
Thank you, Erica. Okay, I will get to that. I just want to give a brief comment on how we got to where we are, because I don't, you know, I understand what Assistant Chief Modica and Rod have been saying, but when you look at this report, it's a 20,000-foot snapshot of a very troubling system, but it doesn't tell us enough of what we need to know. We need the details behind it. That reflects 1,000 or thousands of little individual decisions made by police officers, by district attorneys, all the way up, and then through that it compilates into this data. But when you look at, say, the arrest column, not all arrests are equal. And while I agree, and I've been part of the Mc Jrp process, I agree that it is doing tremendous work in the state to divert people from prison. The troubling thing from this report for me is that it's the chippy charges, it's the small cases. We are putting kids on the path of the criminal justice system with trespasses, with resisting arrest, with interfering with public transportation. And these are offenses that are, the relative rate index is way over 4, it's way over the average. These are drivers to this. And we're doing this at a time when we've systematically disassembled any other social service programs other than schools, which are underfunded, and jails, which in my opinion are overfunded. So there is no option then to put these kids into the jail system. And I think one of the calls to action, it's not something I can unilaterally implement, but I think we need to take a hard look at who we walk in the door of the jail. And we should be very resistant before we walk some kid into jail or some young person into jail, because that is going to have a stickiness on them that will literally haunt them forever. Expungement isn't the answer, because the internet, you live forever on that, and it's just every little arrest, every little conviction, even though it might be not a jail sentence now, it just weighs on them and weighs on them and weighs on them, and we are condemning this whole group of people to live a less fulfilled life because of what we're doing with this process of thinking we're doing the right thing, of we're going to arrest them for this disorderly conduct or this bear jumping. In terms of implementation, the worst thing that could happen, in my opinion, is we have this moment and then we go away. We don't do anything. We have to own it. I am confident, having gone to the Macarthur site visits over in 2015, that, and I said this in one of the early meetings, I'm positive that other jurisdictions are going to find the same thing we did, and they're going to run away from the data. The community that wins, the community that does the right thing, is the community that runs to the data. And that's what we need to do, and that's what I intend to be a part of.
So, Judge Jones, I'm just going to take a couple steps back. Let's talk about the why. Why are we here? And in your perspective, what are some of the solutions?
Well, when we look at this data in the report, there's two kinds of responses. There's the emotional response. We have to own the data. We have to understand that it's our dog that bit him, and that we have to deal with that. That's an emotional response to that data. It's a necessary first step. But then comes the intellectual response to that data. What does it mean? How do you make it into something that becomes a plan for action? And that's exactly where we stand right now. We understand the broad stroke of this data. While the numbers aren't perfect, they will get better, but they're more than sufficient to send the message that we have a giant problem. But when it comes to the intellectual side, where are the levers we can move to change this data? And that is an extremely difficult problem, because in my view, it's not a problem that can be reached case by case. It has to be reached at what I'm going to call a policy level. It's about how we think about these cases. And that's the conversation that we need to have, and I'm pleased to see everybody here, because you got to be part of this conversation.
So everyone here needs to be a part of that conversation. So how do we engage the community in this conversation? And Chief Medica, would you answer that for you?
Certainly. So how do we engage the community? I think it's not a secret that the Portland Police Bureau, as a bureau for the city of Portland, is embodied in a settlement agreement with the Department of Justice for practice and pattern of practice, specifically dealing with issues of those that are suffering mental crisis or mental illness. I bring that to the surface because we have gone out extraordinarily with effort to engage, to have dialogue with the community instead of colonizing the conversation with our plan to look at the community and ask the community what is livable, what is the plan that they would like to see, and use that to help make decisions. But specifically to this issue, there are a couple of things that I think are important to discuss with regard to how and what the conversation could be. Conversations about race are very difficult, but we've got to have them. We've got to have conversations about racial reconciliation. We've got to be able to tell the truth. And the first truth that I tell people, not only locally but nationally, is that as law enforcement professionals, we didn't get everything right, and of course we're sorry. And we really mean that. We are very sorry. And if you cannot do that, you're not going to have a legitimate conversation. And you will not achieve legitimacy. It's been described as police legitimacy, but I think that all points of the system, whether it's law enforcement, prosecution, the bench, child welfare, or education, you have got to have legitimacy with your population that you serve, not that you own. And without any more hyperbole, I will say that this is so important. It is not going to be a quick fix. It's going to be a combination of policies and practices, things that work, and then the courage to say, hey, that's not working. Let's go to something else that will work. I will make one last reference, and that would be to Measure 11. And you all have your own opinions about that. But you definitely know it impacts you in different ways. It has informed your thoughts, and you have seen what has happened with Measure 11. Sentenced inmates, families that have sentenced Measure 11 inmates, and the need to provide some type of reform that seems to be almost impossible.
So if you're just tuning in on OPB, you're listening to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, and we're talking about the racial disparities in our local jails. I'm Erica Pruitt of Multnomah County Department of Community Justice, and I'm here today with Portland's Assistant Police Chief, Modica, Circuit Court Judge, Edward Jones, District Attorney Rod Underhill, and Public Defender and Advocate Lane Borg. So does anyone else want to talk about how we engage the community in this conversation?
Yes. One thing all of you can do is to start thinking about how implicit bias shapes people's thinking and how trauma shapes people's behavior. Out of those two concepts, I think our solutions will be found. That's not going to make those conversations easy, but it's going to make them useful.
So let's go there a little bit more. So understanding that institutional racism is deeply embedded in the United States criminal justice system, given the stark reality of this, how do we integrate social justice and equity as we look at these decision points and as we go forward?
I'll take a shot at that. Okay. It was interesting a lot of people, when you write an op-ed piece, they say don't read the comments. And I read the comments. I found them fascinating. I think it's really interesting because aside from individual people, what they want to do to me, that's fine. You see two pervasive themes coming out of that, and that is one that, well, you know, it's this way because black people commit more crimes. And we know through a lot of empirical research that just isn't true. But the other problem with it is in this report is that the conviction rate is a reflection of the charge rate, not a reflection of the crime rate. And this is what our friends in the victims community tell us all the time, that there's lots of crimes being committed out there that don't get charged. And the other one was, well, it's a poverty issue, not a race issue. And I looked at some things, and I don't need to get into the details now, about like, no, that's not really it either. It seems to be particularly a race thing. So I think what we need to do, and what, you know, we can start from this, is we need a change movement like smoking, like gay marriage, like, you know, it's long term, but you have to start calling people on stuff. When you hear people say things like like, well, it's because black people commit more crimes. Don't let it sit. You got to say as an informed person, that is not right. So, and it may take a paradigm change like that where we really have to look at this. I think that Ed is right. It's a long-term process. It's not a quick fix, but it has to involve, it's a social attitude change that we have to address.
Can I add something?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Hey, well, I want to add, it is extremely important, as we've all talked about and everyone knows, to look at the offenders in our system. But I think your question and some of the remarks that Judge Jones brought up make us want to look at disparities as relate to people who are victims of violence as well. There are victims of violence are the unintentionally involved in the criminal justice system. And there was a report I've now read a few times, the Vera Institute of Justice, titled Young Men of Color and the Other Side of Harm. And it was published back in December of 2014. And the introduction of that report writes about the concern about the disproportionate involvement, I'm quoting, of young men of color in the criminal justice system as those responsible for crime. But then it goes on to say, but still missing, however, is recognition that these young men are also disproportionately victims of crime and violence. The research that they tell us about indicates that young men of color who have been victims of crime and violence often do not get the help that they need. And so the report tells us some other insights about things that we probably instinctively already know, and that is, if that's true, and this report seems, Vera Institute is a national assessment of a very socially conscious group, and if it's true, then we're going to see negative impacts in the area of employment, health, education, and safety. And there are some suggestions that I think we can learn from as we look at this conversation. We can look at people who come into the system as charged individuals, but are we missing opportunities with respect to victims of crime? And that report is telling us, yes, we are. We're missing opportunities to, for example, my office has a victims assistance program. I now have 14 victim advocates. I look around, I see a few other advocates here in the room. And what it's telling us is missed opportunities about people who touch the criminal justice system in whatever way. And so can we develop more services in the community that offer trauma-informed care that's also culturally specific to crime victims, whether they be young toddlers who may, or young adults who may grow up in a home of violence, and other studies have shown us that that is a chemistry for further involvement in the system in sometimes a much more negative way. Can we also, and it's been mentioned, can we also learn more about implicit bias so that communities of color harmed by crime are dealt with by my office, for example, and other parts of the public safety system with care and respect and understanding. The point of these things, I think, is to make sure that we recognize the public safety system has touch points with members of our community to include individuals arrested disproportionately, but I think we need to learn more about and study closer, are we seeing victims of crime that are disproportionately involved as well? And if so, for example, in the area of domestic violence or gang violence or child abuse, and if so, can we do better in that area too?
So, Rod, I have a follow-up to that. So, considering, the people that are going through the criminal justice system as victims of crime, how do we change the mindset around that? How do we incorporate that into, for instance, sentencing?
So I think some of what I've tried to do, and I've had the fortune of being able to hire, because of some increased Victim of Crime Act money, 7 new victim advocates in my office within the last year. And one of the things that was very intentional for me to think about was, I want them to look like and have backgrounds like the communities that we serve. 4 of the 7 are from communities of color and the new advocate group that I've hired. My victim services manager, who's been with me now not quite a year, is also from the community of color. And so one of the things that we can do is have victim services programs that are going to work in our community, that people can sometimes just work with somebody who looks like them. But then also, we need to expand further into services programs. So it's part of it's, all right, I got to get my own, so to speak, shop in order. And I think I've tried working on that in a positive way, I think. But then we need to work with our partners as well. And then through dialogue and understanding and experience and services, are we going to have positive collateral impacts as it relates to conversations about sentencing? And I think the answer is yes. One will beget the other, I think.
Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on this one?
When victims come to my courtroom, they rarely want to tell me what to do. They ask me, what can you do to make sure this won't happen again? That's what I hear from victims. They don't have the answer either, but they're interested in what we can do. And unfortunately, we don't really have satisfactory responses to those questions.
You know, I agree with everything my fellow panelists have said here, but I wanted to make sure that the conversation is balanced, right? So there's aspiration and obligation. And I believe this is something that we are all obligated to work on. And for instance, at the Portland Police Bureau, harm reduction is very, very big thematically and in the things that we are doing to reform our internal practice. Training and exposure to how it is what we do may reflect some implicit bias. What can we do about that? Harm reduction, what do we do about young people who are in homes that have experienced the trauma of either seeing a parent arrested or something happening next door? What is our connectivity? What is our obligation to work on that? Harm reduction, what is our obligation and our intention to eliminate barriers, right, from barrier decisions? If I'm 14 and I've hit my friend in the head with a rock, is it better for me to be referred and receive RAP services that address trauma-informed care and address a reflection of culturally specific care and treatment? Or is it better for me to just be funneled through the system, prosecuted as a felon, and have to live with that? These are the things where when we can have an effect, be it that we use the risk assessment tool to deflect or divert, or to work with our partners to build systems that provide care at the front end and allow us to use discretion at the best circumstance and the best time, while remembering, as my colleague Rod Underhill said, that victimization is just as important in communities of color and in vulnerable communities. There is a requirement and a responsibility to provide public safety for everyone.
Eric, I just would add to that it's interesting to me in what I hear Ed and Kevin and Rod talking about, and I certainly support, is that all of that happens or only happens when you have true judicial discretion. You get away from determinate sentencing, because determinate sentencing it makes it irrelevant what the characteristics or individual background. Determinate sentencing is not trauma-informed. Trauma-informed is the individual. You look at the individual, you look at the victim, you look at the defendant, you look at everybody involved in that, and you consider what their circumstances are to get what Kevin is talking about. You can't do what Kevin is talking about unless you look at the individual and the circumstances and have the discretion to do it. And that's going to be another big change we've come, because we have a 25-year march, and it's a march in this state and around the country towards determinate sentencing and less discretion. I give Rod a lot of props. We do a lot more discretionary sentencing and consideration of that in this county than in a lot of other counties, but this has to be a statewide thing. That we can't just be an island here in Multnomah County. We need to get more discretion so we can have those informed conversations and figure out what the right thing is for this situation.
Understanding that this is a long-term process. I hear a lot of times us saying, we just need to get out of our ways. So I would like to ask all the panelists, what do you see as the biggest barrier to our success in this? And we'll start with Judge Jones.
Well, I'll say it's habitual behavior is the key enemy that we face. And shaking ourselves out of the ruts is the task.
You know, I would say quite honestly, ground truth, it is the fear of loss rather than the anticipation of gain. We can make gain in our society and our civic, organizational responsibilities by moving forward on what we know is the right thing to do. But the fear of loss of control, the fear of loss of reflective peer appreciation, and the lack of organizational courage gets in the way of us doing what has to be done.
So, in addition to what's already been said, I believe we need to have serious conversations about services available in our community. When we talk about felony-related cases, we commonly find ourselves in meetings and rooms. Sometimes we tend to refer to ourselves as the usual suspects. And we continue to talk about this notion of felony probation and resources and such. And what we're seeing time and time again, more and more, is a reduction in available services. And we need to be flip-flopping that. It needs to be just the opposite. And when I talk about services, it's not us, and it's not many of the people in this room. I'm talking about services available for homeless, services available for veterans, services available for those impacted by mental health, addiction, domestic violence, other traumas that occur in our community. And we're seeing not enough. And I see friends in the Parole and Probation Division here, Scott Taylor, and and Pat Schreiner and others. We're commonly having conversations that we're stretching our resources of available services in the community. We need more of those, especially as we continue to have serious conversations about alternatives to jail and prison, which we're having and we want to have more of. But we need to make sure that we're just not pushing one situation into what would be, at least potentially, a bigger situation if we don't address the underlying root of what it is that is at issue.
Eric, I guess the thing I would say, and your question was about, what's the barriers? And I think that the barriers are that it seems overwhelming and it seems like we just can't get there. But I think we can, and but it takes action like now. You got to start. You just have to start down that road. You have to, if you haven't read the report, read the report. When there's more information that rolls out about this, as there will be, read that. Just inform yourself, and as I said before, call people on their assumptions. Have a conversation about that, keep that going, because the worst thing that could happen is we have this moment and then we go back to business as usual. But that's I think the hard thing is everybody's going to have to change, even if it's just a little bit, and it has to start now.
On that note, how many of you have heard of the Harvard implicit bias test? Now, how many of you have taken it? All right. Take it 10 times. See if you can improve your score. Right? Because that's the beginning of some insight into this problem. Everything starts from looking inward. Then we can start moving on to make some progress.
I want to make sure that our comments are not unintentionally twisted. I've been in this profession for 30 years. I wear this uniform as an artifact of the responsibility that we have to the men and women and children and families in the city of Portland and the state of Oregon. In the state of Oregon, we most recently lost a fellow law enforcement officer. A very sad day. The commonality that you will hear when law enforcement is described: great person, family person, community connected, diligent to the job. All of those things are true because we do this for you. I do not want for 1 minute anyone to think that as we discuss these very serious issues, that we are putting the burden and the blame on any one piece of the system or accusing anyone of being a racist and being power hungry or not caring about people. It is in fact because we care about people that we engage in this work, the hard lift, the leadership, and the courage to discuss and move forward to repeal and build better policy and better practice for everyone.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I want to end on a note that talks about vision and hope. So I want each of you to just give the audience a sense of understanding that this is overwhelming, understanding that what was revealed in the report is going to be long-term for us to make some of those changes. What is your greatest hope for our future of our community related to this?
So I'll go first. Our greatest hope, and maybe I will refer to yesterday for a moment. I think it's been touched on that this community was visited by our U.S. Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, hosted by our U.S. District of Oregon Attorney, Bill Williams, who's here. That was a moment of great hope in many ways because she was here for a reason. She was here because this community is an outstanding community. We're an outstanding community for a number of reasons. One of the most remarkable things about us is that we communicate with one another. We, I think, like each other, we challenge each other, and we are ornery at times with each other when we need to be. But always with a well-intentioned motivation to make us better at what we do. And our U.S. Attorney for the United States came to let us know that that's not lost on her or the rest of the country. We got to hear about it. And as I was mentioning, and I'll wrap up, as I was mentioning to someone else, it was a great couple of hours that many of us got to spend with her and talk with others and hear kind of positive things. And then as I said to somebody as I was leaving, heading back to the office, time to get back to work. And so that's another part of what is great about this community. And I think the vision for hope is we're not done. And in fact, this report tells us we're far from done. In many ways, we really need to roll up our sleeves and get to work in this area.
So I guess what I'll reference is what I sort of started with, which I hope that my greatest hope for this in the short run, or the not too distant future, is that we take this data, we look at the underlying data that supports it, that created it, and we look at the stories it's telling us, and the conclusion I hope we come to is that this is starting in very small stuff. Oftentimes the thing, people, it's kind of rare to have your very first offense be a Measure 11 arrest. It's starting on these little things. And those are discretionary calls, and I feel like we're making these calls on shoplifting cases or TriMet cases or trespasses cases. We're making this call because we have no other alternative, or the police, Kevin and I have spent a lot of time together on this and agree. The police officer needs to be able to do something when there's a disruption going on in the street. Because of the way the social choices we've made jail about the only option that they can do. And I'm hoping that we can, through this report and through this research, learn that that is so damaging, that it is hurting that individuals and collectively hurting our society, and that we can be reinvigorated to find another alternative, find a different door to take that kid through so that it doesn't start them down the path to where you see that picture when they're 35 or 40 years old and you're saying, oh gosh, that guy, of course he's going to DOC.
Well, let me say that what makes me hopeful is that we have not descended into the blame game. In other words, the various components of the system are working together. Now, a very famous trial judge, Michael Marcus, said, blame, like love, is not diminished by sharing. And we have to accept our responsibility, but not engage in that game. And what makes me the most hopeful is the absence of that pointing fingers. So I think we are on our way.
So we're going to go to open mic questions. So we might get some questions asked that get at some more of this. If you're just tuning in on OPB, you're listening to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, and we're talking about the racial disparities in our local jails. I'm Erica Pruitt with the Multnomah County's Department of Community Justice, and I'm here with Portland's Assistant Police Chief Kevin Modica, Circuit Court Judge Edward Jones, District Attorney Rod Underhill, and Public Defender and Advocate Lane Bork. Let's now go to the audience for questions. So if you've written your question on an index card, hold it high for the staff to collect, and I'll read at least one index card. At this time, we invite City Club members to ask their questions at the microphone. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less.
Hi, my name is Sarah Wilson, and I am a civic scholar from Park Rose High School, and my question is, what do you believe is the main factor for the rising incarcerations of people of color?
A lack of resources. It's really just that simple, Sarah. It's a lack of resources, right? It doesn't lay on the shoulders of only one portion of the system. If there's nowhere to take you if you're having mental health or mental crisis, or you happen to be in crisis at that moment, if there's no off-ramp, if there's no alternative, it has been seen nationally that jail becomes the answer. It's the same in the juvenile population, services and capacity.
Let me, just if I could, I don't disagree with what Kevin said, but I think there's a little bit more to that, and I think we need to be reflective on the things in our system where characteristics you ascribe, where witnesses or people give a, these become enhancement factors. There can literally be the difference between whether you get probation or whether you get prison is whether you're acting in affiliation with other people. And we know that there are studies that say when you see people of other colors, you see them acting together. You assume they're acting together. And unfortunately, that tragic misjudgment can literally make the difference between whether you get probation or you get parole, even assuming you did the underlying crime of the assault or the robbery. And I think we have to be very careful that we're looking at that hard to make sure that implicit bias isn't reflecting itself that way and causing us to look at people as gangs or as going in, acting this way and getting prison sentences when that wasn't what the statute called for.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Betty Dominguez. I'm the Director of Policy and Equity at Home Forward, which is the housing authority that serves Multnomah County. And this isn't a question so much as it is just a comment and address specifically to Lane. We went to ban the box in employment a couple of years ago, and we knew that wasn't enough. So we are now working in partnership with Metropolitan Public Defenders. We've allocated funding, and we're in the middle of program design to work on expunging records for all of the young people and young adults that live with us. We know that that's also a barrier to housing. It's our first step towards moving to ban the box in housing. So very pleased to have that partnership with you. And it's a one-year program, so we'll be happy to report back and see how it did and if we can expand it. Thank you.
And thank you very much. I think this is a great program.
Urias Johnson, Director of Civil Rights for the Oregon Attorney General, member since 3/1/2016. I want to take a couple of things you said real quickly. Y'all mentioned implicit bias. You mentioned community involvement. If people remember just recently, a young lady got fired for doing a report for the sheriff that found excessive use of force. One of her points were what was actually being taught was being undermined by the images and attitudes of the presenters. Each one of y'all up there, police officers, judges, public defenders, DAs, are subjected to training. How feasible is it to open up your training to community oversight so they can find out when these implicit biases arise so they can be caught and kind of worked out of the system itself?
You're right. So I'm going to start because you really touched something that resonates with me and is actually part of our progressive change in policy and practice. We have a training advisory committee that's made up of citizen members and other professionals that inform us on our training practices and creation. We also have a dedicated equity manager that reports to the chief and looks at all things that go on in the Bureau from top to bottom with the lens of equity before we start making decisions that are going to impact the public and inform our workforce. I would say that because these movements are newer, that the data may not reflect what people are saying they experience or that they experience, but I certainly guarantee to you that we are on the road towards that type of transparency in what we do with regard to training at the Portland Police Bureau.
And as to judicial training, you've touched on a sore point because bluntly, there's nowhere near enough of it. And even of what there is, little of it goes to these implicit biases and trauma-informed kinds of education that judges should get, and we're working towards providing them. How it would work to have everybody there, that's an interesting discussion. I'm not against it, but it does seem like it has its complications.
You're right. I think the training not only has to be fine, come in and do it, it needs to be done by outsiders because we're not, we created the problem, right? We're the people doing the work that created the problem, so we have to own that and then get help from outside. But I think the transparency part, really, to me, the better transparency part is we need to do the red report every half year. We should be doing this, we can't just do it once and then say, gosh, we did that back in 2015. The transparency is going to come when we see whether our numbers change. We have to continue that work and publish it and own it.
And I guess I'll finish up by saying a lot of us got to spend some time with your wife yesterday, and she's doing an outstanding job. Hey, but to answer the question, I want to add to what I think all three said. We need to bring in outside trainers on some of these very important issues. Early on, following my election, I brought in the equity and diversity lens from the county and had over 200 of my employees go through a series of days of training to understand how we can do our work better. We've also talked about trauma-informed care. I brought in outside trainers, sometimes I lose track of time, about 9 months ago, to train us on our own self-care because my 200 employees doing the work we do, sometimes we see some things and experience some things that are troubling, but more importantly, how do we work with the outside community, people that are coming to our office, and how are we interacting with them? And so once again, trained a couple of hundred folks with outside individuals, experts from the Portland State University. We videotape that training, and it's available for us to refresh our memories, make available to individuals to show if they're interested in what we got trained on in those two areas, certainly.
Okay, now I'm going to go to a question from the index card. So the question is, what do you think about risk assessments as they could be used in sentencing as it relates to racial and ethnic disparities?
We are moving aggressively towards using risk assessment tools, risk and needs assessment as a way of understanding how to reduce crime. It's not clear to me that those issues have as much racial content as you might think. So what that overlap is bluntly unclear to me. As we get more informed about bias and about trauma-informed, we will do better with the whites and the blacks.
So that question may have come from someone associated with the Mc Jrp program. You've heard me mention it in some of my earlier comments, Multnomah County Justice Reinvestment Program. It is unique in the country, and one of the things that makes it the most unique, and probably the single reason that it is unique throughout the United States, is that we are using a risk needs assessment as part of a pretrial assessment in order to better inform us on an appropriate disposition. We add every other variable that you can all think of into that equation as well, but the LSCMI is the risk needs assessment that we use today. And again, no one in the country is doing what we do. Is it moving the dial in a positive way relative to the RRI index? Is it changing in a positive way the disproportionate number of individuals of color going to prison? And just, I guess coincidentally, we had that very conversation this morning at 7 a.m., and I'm pleased to be able to tell the group here that wasn't there with us at 7 a.m. that about 10 of us are going to meet in my office and have that very discussion about how do we assess this very important question. Have we landed on a practice of assessing cases through the Mc Jrp program that is revolutionary in a number of ways to even potentially include helping with this conversation? We'll see. We need to look at that, and we're going to.
And just briefly, I would add, and I've been a supporter of using risk assessment in this Mc Jrp process because it gets away from the sort of dictates of mandatory sentencing and more talking about what the offender's specific needs are to be safe. But I do have concerns, and as Rod has reminded us many times, we have to have professional judgment inform the risk assessment. And one of the concerns I have is if you look at one of the factors, criminogenic factors, in the LSCMI, it talks about things like, what was your age of first conviction? Well, this goes back to what I've been talking about before. If we're finding kids of color and getting them a conviction early, well, boy, we've really affected their risk assessment forever. And if we say, well, it's risky, it's a criminogenic factor to hang out with people who have criminal convictions, we'll take a whole community and give all of them convictions. Now all of them have higher risk because they're hanging out with criminals. So those are the concerns I have. I want to go down that path. I think we can fix it and work on it, but we have to question it, informed ourselves, and then and make adjustments when necessary.
I wanted to add one thing is that when you start talking about using a tool that can be described as a risk assessment tool, along with Lane's concern, I think we have to be very careful. But the one place where risk assessment is not formalized is at the point of contact. And nationally, that is something that we are following, we are very interested in looking at, and there may be opportunities for us to begin using that type of tool, but with very, very serious care, because we want to get away from labeling. We don't want to administer something that we don't have the skill to administer, and it's got to be relevant and valid.
Okay, we're going to take one more question from the audience.
Thank you so much. Catherine McDowell, City Club member. I have a question for District Attorney Underhill. And my question is, in 2013, you published an op-ed opposing comprehensive sentencing reform on the basis that the justice system was working. Based on the Macarthur Foundation report, which indicates that the justice system is clearly not working for communities of color, were you wrong then, and will you reconsider your position on comprehensive sentencing reform now? Thank you.
So I believe that that article was written at the infancy of the 3194 conversation. The original iteration of 3194 was much different than and when I say 3194, that's the prison reform bill that I mentioned earlier today. It was a different iteration, and that, I believe, goes to the heart of what I was talking about at the time. I then rolled up my sleeves, got to work, worked with the governor's office, key legislators, and I have to say, in a moment, I guess, of pointed, not attempting to brag, I helped to bring the Oregon District Attorneys Association, the Chiefs of Police, and the Sheriff's Association from Oregon, all in support, as I was, with that prison reform bill, House Bill 3194. So while I had early concerns about that version of the bill, I got to work on it, and then I believe made a difference. And I think this community is really experiencing the positives of House Bill 3194, and I'm quite proud of that work.
We're out of broadcast time for further questions. This is Greg McPherson, President of City Club. Please join me in thanking our guests, as well as Walter Robinson of the Friday Forum Committee, who produced today's program. We are adjourned.